We've all met someone whose ego didn't just want love, it wanted control. Someone who thrived on the highs and lows, the arguments, the need for validation, the emotional chase. And in the middle of all that noise, you found something stronger than the need to win the fight. You found silence. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not even about him. It's about the moment you realize that the most powerful move isn't to scream louder. It's to say nothing at all. Because when his ego wanted power, your silence took it all. He wanted control, not just in the obvious ways, through decisions or conversations, but in the subtler moments too, how you reacted, how quickly you replied, how often you needed his approval. His ego thrived off your responses. Every time you defended yourself, tried to explain your worth, or asked him to see your side, it gave him a sense of power. It let him feel like he was the one in control of your emotions. And for a while, maybe you thought that if you just said the right thing, he'd finally understand you. If you stayed calm, he'd listen. If you gave more, he'd finally give back. But he didn't want understanding. He wanted dominance disguised as connection. What you didn't realize at the time is that your reactions were his fuel. Whether it was anger, confusion, desperation, or even just sadness. It all gave him a hit of validation. It told him, I still have an effect on her. She still cares. I still matter. And the more you responded, the more he knew how much space he occupied in your mind. That space, your mental and emotional real estate, became his playground. Because ego doesn't need love to feel alive. It needs attention. It needs noise. It needs energy. And then something happened. You stopped reacting. Not out of pettiness, not to play a game, not to punish, but because you reached a point of clarity. You saw that the power dynamic wasn't shifting through explanation. It was only reinforcing the imbalance. So instead of speaking, you went still. Instead of proving your worth, you walked in it. And that's when everything changed. Not just in the way he saw you, but in the way you saw yourself. Silence does something that words never can. It creates a vacuum, and in that vacuum, people hear their own echoes. He suddenly couldn't gauge where you stood, how you felt, or whether you still cared. The more he tried to provoke a response, and got nothing, the more unstable the foundation of his power became, because it wasn't built on strength. It was built on your energy. And when you withdrew that energy, the illusion collapsed. Your silence wasn't passive. It was powerful. It was deliberate. And in that space, you reclaimed what he thought he owned. Your attention, your peace, your ability to walk away without needing permission. He mistook your silence for confusion or weakness. But it wasn't confusion. It was certainty. It was the unshakable calm that comes from knowing, deep down, that someone who needs to manipulate your emotions to feel important never deserved your energy in the first place. This was the twist he never saw coming. He expected you to fight, to plead, to argue, to chase, but you didn't. You became still. Not because you were defeated, but because you finally realized that power doesn't come from having the last word. It comes from knowing you no longer need to speak. He used to read your reactions like a map, guiding him through your insecurities and your hopes. But now, there's no map, no signal, no explanation, just silence, and in that silence, his ego, once so loud, so certain, began to unravel. Because when a person feeds off control, the one thing they can't survive is being ignored. You didn't take revenge. You didn't start a war. You just took back your peace. And to a man who only felt powerful when he had your attention, that was the one thing he couldn't handle. Silence is often misunderstood. People think if you're not speaking, it means you're unsure, passive, or afraid. But sometimes, silence is the clearest form of self-respect. It's the moment you decide that explaining yourself, over and over, is no longer a conversation, but a performance. A performance for someone who has no intention of understanding you, only of controlling how you feel. And the day you go quiet, not out of confusion but out of clarity, is the day everything changes. There was a time when you tried to communicate. You wanted to work through it, fix it, find a way to connect. You thought that if you just said it in the right way, with enough calm and patience, he'd finally see you, hear you, and meet you halfway. But every attempt turned into another emotional loop, one where he shifted the blame, dodged accountability, or twisted your words to make you doubt yourself. And slowly, you began to realize you weren't having real conversations. You were being pulled into emotional traps designed to make him feel stronger and you feel smaller. So you stopped, not because you gave up, but because you woke up. You realized that continuing to speak was costing you your peace. You saw that every sentence you gave him became a weapon he'd use later. And so you chose silence, not as a retreat, but as a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. Not, I don't know what to say, but I've said enough. That silence said everything. It said, I won't be baited anymore. It said, you're not entitled to my explanations. It said, you no longer have access to my vulnerability. Because when you stop responding, you stop giving the illusion that he still has influence over your emotional world. And for someone whose ego thrives on seeing your highs and lows, that absence of reaction is louder than anything you could ever say. He may have expected drama, a fight, a final plea, because that's what his ego counted on, that you'd always show up for one more argument, one more emotional apology, one more conversation that led nowhere. But when you chose stillness, it broke the script. He couldn't manipulate what you weren't offering anymore. The silence became the mirror he never wanted to look into, because in that quiet, he had to face himself. And without your voice filling the space, he finally heard his own. Silence isn't about being cold or indifferent. It's about being finished. It's about stepping out of a dynamic that's designed to exhaust you. It's the decision to stop setting yourself on fire just to keep the relationship warm. And while he might have once felt powerful, knowing he could draw a reaction from you, your silence stripped that power away. You stopped playing the game, and the moment you did, you won it. Because silence, when it comes from strength, isn't avoidance. It's wisdom. It's understanding that some things aren't worth explaining to someone who's already decided not to hear you. And in that moment, you don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to defend your boundaries. You don't need to argue your worth. Your silence says it all. It says, I've found something more important than your validation. I've found myself. And he can't argue with that. He can't manipulate it. He can't twist it. Because silence holds a power no words can touch. It's not emptiness. It's presence. It's not defeat. It's authority. And once you start speaking with silence, you realize you never needed to prove your point. You just needed to stop trying to prove it to someone who was never really listening. He thought your attention meant power. Every time you called back, replied quickly, explained yourself, or tried to make things work, he interpreted it as control, not because he loved you deeply or wanted to meet you halfway, but because his ego read your effort as proof that he still had influence. He mistook your emotional investment for weakness. He believed that because you still cared, he still held the upper hand. That's the trap of ego. It confuses connection with control and attention with authority. He didn't understand that access isn't the same as importance. He had access to your time, your energy, your heart, and he assumed that gave him significance. But what he failed to see was that your kindness, your openness, your willingness to try weren't signs of submission. They were signs of love. And love, when it's strong, can look like patience. It can look like trying again. But love has limits. And the moment you reached yours, you didn't explode. You didn't make a scene. You simply stopped showing up the way you used to. That shift, quiet but firm, was the beginning of the end of his illusion. He didn't notice it at first. He thought maybe you were just giving him space. Maybe you'd come around. Maybe this was just another phase in the usual pattern. But it wasn't. Because this time, it wasn't silence meant to provoke a reaction. It wasn't a strategy to get his attention. It was a withdrawal, a decision to end the cycle. And that, more than anything, was what he couldn't control. Because now, your energy wasn't revolving around him anymore. He no longer had access to the version of you that would bend. explain, forgive too easily, or overextend. That's when it hit him. Your attention wasn't something he deserved, it was something you gave. And once you stopped giving it, he realized just how much power he thought he had was never actually his. He had power over you only because you allowed him to influence you, because you still believed in the relationship enough to try. But when belief fades, so does power. You stopped believing in the idea of what it could be and started seeing it for what it was: one-sided, unstable, conditional. He may have called you dramatic, cold, accused you of shutting down, but deep down he felt the shift. He felt the loss of access, and with it, the loss of power. Because someone whose identity is built on being chased, forgiven, and emotionally prioritized cannot handle irrelevance. When you walked away, not physically but emotionally, when you became unreachable not out of pride, but out of peace, he realized he was no longer central to your world. He was just someone passing through it. This is where ego falls apart. It believes it can manipulate the same situation forever, that it can provoke the same reactions endlessly. But people grow. They outgrow confusion, manipulation, and emotional exhaustion. You did. And when you stopped offering your energy freely, you sent a message louder than words ever could. You don't get to occupy space in my life just because you used to. His control was never real. It was borrowed. And you finally took it back. So he was left there, wondering how the game ended when he didn't even get the last move. That's the thing with people who thrive on control. They never expect the one they underestimated to simply stop playing. You didn't take revenge. You didn't make a scene. You just left the conversation. And without your attention, the illusion of his power disappeared with it. There was a time when you believed closure came through conversation, that if you just had one more talk, one more explanation, one more moment of clarity, everything could settle. But some people don't want resolution. They want control. And the more you tried to reason, the more it slipped away. You began to notice that your words were being used against you. That calm conversations turned into confusion. That expressing your needs somehow made you look too much. And after a while, you stopped feeling heard. You started feeling drained. That's when something inside you shifted. You didn't slam doors or scream. You didn't write long texts, trying to make him understand. You simply began to pull away. Not in anger, but in clarity. You realized you didn't need a fight to reclaim your power. You didn't need to be louder. You just needed to stop engaging. It was no longer about winning or proving anything. It was about protecting your energy. The most powerful decisions often come without announcements. You didn't have to say, "I'm done." You just stopped participating in the chaos. He expected resistance. People like him always do. He thought there would be tears, arguments, or emotional outbursts. That's how it always worked. He'd push, provoke, and wait for you to snap so he could say you were the problem. That pattern gave him leverage. It kept you on the defensive, always explaining, always trying to fix things. But this time you gave him nothing. Not because you had nothing to say, but because you finally saw that your piece wasn't up for discussion. That silence, it was louder than any argument. It dismantled the game he thought he could keep playing. He lost the script he relied on. The part where you chase, cry, or convince. Your silence broke the rhythm, and with it, his sense of control. Because when someone depends on your reactions to feel powerful, your refusal to react becomes the ultimate shift in power. He didn't get closure, not because you wanted to punish him, but because you realized he never offered you the same. You stopped needing fairness from someone who never played fair. In your stillness, you did something bold. You closed the chapter without needing him to read the last page. And that, more than anything, left him powerless. Because silence isn't about ignoring someone. It's about protecting yourself. It's about choosing not to pour energy into a space that has only taken from you. You weren't trying to hurt him. You were finally healing yourself, quietly, without drama, without spectacle. He may have called it avoidance or emotional distance, but deep down he knew exactly what it was: strength. The kind of strength that doesn't fight for what hurts anymore. You took back control by no longer needing to be right, by no longer seeking the kind of connection that demanded self-abandonment. And in that moment, you stopped asking him to value your voice and started valuing your own silence. Because sometimes the most powerful closure comes from walking away with your dignity intact, not slamming the door, but gently closing it, knowing that if someone truly valued you, you'd never had to explain yourself so many times in the first place. So you walked quietly, and with every step, you reclaimed pieces of yourself you didn't even realize you had handed over. You left him not with anger, but with absence. And in that absence, the power he thought he had simply disappeared. Confidence isn't loud. It doesn't beg, it doesn't chase, and it certainly doesn't try to prove itself to someone who keeps overlooking it. Real confidence knows that arguing with someone who doesn't respect your truth is just another form of self-betrayal. And that's what you realized. There was a point where you stopped trying to make him see your side. You stopped needing to be understood by someone who only ever listened to respond, not to truly hear you. And instead of continuing the back and forth, you simply walked away, quietly, without a warning shot, not because you didn't care, but because you finally did. You used to think strength meant staying, that fighting for the relationship showed how deep your love was. And maybe it did, for a while. But love without respect turns into self-sacrifice. And slowly, you started noticing that every time you stood up for yourself, you were met with deflection, denial, or manipulation. It wasn't a conversation, it was a tug of war. And eventually, you got tired of holding the rope. He didn't expect you to let go. He thought you'd always come back, always explain, always soften. Because that's what you used to do. That's what kept him feeling in control. The knowing that no matter how far things went, you'd still be there, trying. But this time, trying felt like begging, like bleeding to prove your worth, and something in you snapped, not from rage, but from truth, from the deep realization that the most confident thing you could do wasn't to argue anymore. It was to leave. Confidence is quiet because it knows its value. It doesn't try to convince someone to treat it right. It doesn't try to fix someone who refuses to meet halfway. Confidence is not saying, "I'll show you what you lost, but I won't lose myself to prove a point." And when you decided to exit, not as a threat, but as a final act of self-respect, you did the one thing he couldn't argue with. You disappeared from the dynamic. No more defending yourself. No more trying to interpret mixed signals. No more giving explanations that fell on selective ears. He may have accused you of giving up too easily, of walking away without fighting for love. But that's the irony. He never noticed how hard you were fighting while you were still there. He only felt the loss once the silence arrived, once your absence stopped giving him something to push against. Because people who feed off control rely on reaction. They rely on you staying emotionally available, even in pain. When you left the conversation altogether, there was nothing left for him to manipulate. And it hurt. Not because you were cruel, but because you finally showed what strength looks like when it's not performing for approval, when it doesn't need to prove anything. You didn't leave in a storm, you left in peace. And that peace was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. Because it wasn't just silence. It was the sound of no longer needing him to understand you. The sound of closing a chapter without bitterness, only certainty. He wanted you to fight for it forever. But you learned that confidence doesn't fight for what constantly breaks it. It walks away, not with drama, but with self-trust. And in doing so, you showed him, and more importantly yourself, that you were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong person. And the most powerful answer to that is not another argument. It's goodbye. Quiet, final, and free. He thought you wanted revenge. That your silence, your distance, your refusal to engage was a strategy to punish him. But he completely missed the point. You weren't interested in revenge. You were interested in peace. The kind of peace that comes when you stop fighting battles that only ever wounded you. The kind that settles in when you no longer need to prove your worth to someone who kept asking you to shrink for the sake of their ego. You weren't trying to win. You were trying to stop losing yourself. For someone whose ego is built on control, not getting a reaction feels like failure. He wanted you to be upset. He wanted a dramatic exit, a final blowout, something he could point to and say, "Look what she did," because then he could feel justified. Then he could twist the story and protect his pride. But you didn't give him that. You didn't scream. You didn't accuse. You didn't demand apologies you knew wouldn't be sincere. You just stopped showing up for the emotional circus. You walked away without a performance. And that's what he never saw coming. He tried to bait you. Maybe through silence of his own. Maybe through mixed signals, breadcrumb messages, or passive, aggressive gestures. Because he needed to know he still had a hold on you. But you didn't bite. Because you weren't playing the game anymore. You had nothing left to prove. You finally saw how much energy you were pouring into someone who never saw the weight of your effort. And once you realized that, revenge seemed pointless. What could you take from someone who already lost access to the best version of you? You chose peace, not to be noble, but because it was the only way to truly heal. Retaliation would have kept you tethered to the same story. But peace set you free. It allowed you to leave with your dignity intact. You didn't need to prove how wrong he was. You just needed to reclaim your space, your voice, and your clarity. You didn't burn the bridge. You just stopped crossing it. And without your presence, he lost the one thing his ego fed on: your energy. People like him don't fear losing love. They fear losing control. And when you finally stopped responding, it shattered the illusion he built. He may not say it out loud, but he felt it. He felt the difference between being ignored and being irrelevant. Because your silence wasn't passive. It was intentional. It was the firmest boundary you ever set. Not with words, but with absence. He lost you, not in one dramatic moment, but in the quiet consistency of your non-response. And that's what truly unraveled him. He thought he had time. He thought the door would always be half open. But you closed it, not out of malice, but out of self-respect. And now he's left trying to understand how he lost something he thought he controlled. That's the thing about ego. It confuses possession with value. He didn't realize that just because he had access to you didn't mean he was treating you right. And when that access was gone, it left a void his pride couldn't fill. You didn't win by being colder, louder, or meaner. You won by not needing to win at all, by stepping out of a cycle that only ever drained you. That's what true power looks like. Not in proving someone wrong, but in refusing to let them keep pulling you into their chaos. Your peace was the answer to every argument he tried to start. And while he may never admit it, he'll remember that silence. Because in the end, that's what took away the one thing he couldn't live without: your attention. He came for your reactions, your energy, your attention. His ego craved power, and for a while, it got what it wanted, because you gave what you thought was love. But somewhere along the way, you woke up. You saw the game for what it was, and instead of playing harder, you stopped playing altogether. Your silence wasn't the absence of care. It was the presence of self-worth. And the moment you chose peace over proving yourself, you took back everything he thought he had control over. That's what he'll remember. Not the last fight, not the last word, but the quiet exit that ended it all. Because in the end, the loudest thing you ever said was nothing at all.